Hello and welcome to episode number 80. This is part 2 of our Flip Wilson special, Gar. And of course, last time when we did part 1, we talked all about the history of Flip Wilson and his rise to fame. And for part 2, we thought it would be fun. You and I each come up with a list of each of our top 5 performers from a Flip Wilson show, very much like we did with the when we did the same thing with the Ed Sullivan special we did. And oddly enough, the reason we're doing this show is because your number one performer from the Ed Sullivan show was, of course, Flip Wilson. And oddly, oddly enough, Flip Wilson would appear on the Ed Sullivan show like a total of 26 times. And so that's how we got to today's episode. So I'm going to start off with my number 5, if you don't mind, which was Lucille Ball. Now, Lucy appeared only one time on the Flip Wilson show in 1971, and she appeared in 2 skits now. Also on the same episode was JoJo the Dancing Horse. You just that's something that can't really be described. You got to see it. But now, Lucille Ball also did a scene with, of course, Flip Wilson's character, Geraldine. Now, the reason I'm including this performance is people got to remember, like, Lucille Ball in her heyday was, I Love Lucy going back to the 1950s. So by the time she's, appearing on the Flip Wilson show, she's kind of, she's not in her heyday anymore. She's kind of semi-retired.
But she's still considered at that juncture. She was considered royalty.
Exactly, and that's why she's included here. Because and just to give you an example of what you're talking about, I wrote down that the one episode she appeared on, it got like 85K views on YouTube alone. So again, just to kind of show you Lucille Ball's place in the world back then,
Well, when I was researching, for this, I saw that episode that you're talking about, the horse.
Yeah.
It's pretty funny.
Yeah.
Oh, my God.
Yeah. And again, I thought it was kind of interesting because, like you said, at the time, Lucille Ball's kind of still very popular at the time. She, at that time, was appearing a lot on The Tonight Show and late night shows like that. And so I was kind of surprised that, although she did appear on the Flip Wilson show, it was only one time, but it was a huge appearance, even so. And I think it showed Lucy kind of, in a different atmosphere, although she's known as a comedian. Primarily everybody thinks of I Love Lucy, and this got the audience to see her kind of in a different light, doing a skit written by, somebody else.
Yes.
Yeah.
It was, she still had it.
Yeah, exactly. That's my point.
That's the thing.
That's my point.
When we were watching, when I was watching it and just being thoroughly entertained.
I mean,
it was really, she still had it.
Yeah, and the interesting thing about it, Gar, even back in the 1970s when, she did this one appearance on the Flip Wilson show. I mean, stand-up comedians were kind of a new thing up, on the rise, but it was mostly, let's be honest, male comedians. At that time, probably the only other female comedians besides Lucille Ball that were getting any kind of recognition would be like Phyllis Diller and Joan Rivers. So again, these are all 3 women that really stood out and made their mark, and so that's all I'll say on that matter.
Well, yeah, it's you mentioned Phyllis Diller.
Yeah.
she's a lost diamond.
Yeah, she's been gone so long that she's
nobody really remembers.
Yeah.
But she was wild.
Yes.
My God, she was. The thing was, I remember as a kid when I was seeing Phyllis Diller. I know we're a little off track, but
it's all right. Yeah.
But I was a little kid and I was watching Phyllis Diller, and And I just was kind of mentally figuring it out. What's going on here, and I was asking my parents, about what was the deal with her, and the thing that they pointed out was her hair was always a mess.
Yeah.
And when you're talking about back in the 50s, that was so faux pas.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Women just, it wasn't done. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And if it was like, just, it shocked people. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so when people look at her now, they look at her and because hairstyles have changed and everything, you look at her hair and it looks like it could be any freaking style now.
Yeah.
But back in the 1950s,
she stood
her
out.
hair was a freaking mess.
Now, Gar, let's get to who was your number 5 on your list?
The Smothers Brothers.
Oh, wow. Yeah, of course.
Yes.
Talked a lot about them before.
I just remember them. They were so funny, so witty. You know what I mean? They're Mom always liked you best, and all that style. They were just really hilarious. But it was the Flip Wilson. It was that time period.
Yeah.
That I was discovering them and how they were mixing. Playing music with comedy. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
that was their thing.
And oddly enough, Gar, as we previously discussed during the Ed Sullivan special, the Smothers Brothers also, very much like Flip Wilson, got one of their first appearances on the Ed Sullivan Show.
Yes, and they went on to do, just like Flip Wilson, they went on to do their own very, very popular show. Oh my God!
Yeah,
it was so popular that one of the characters that was on the Smothers Brothers, that wasn't even the Smothers Brothers, became like so popular. When he did this, he was running for Pat Paulson for president.
Yeah.
Pat Paulson was a side character on the Smothers Brothers show, and when he was running for president at that time, as a comedy thing, it just exploded in popularity. Yeah. So that just kind of gives you an idea. This is not even the Smothers Brothers.
Yeah.
And a side character on their show becomes extremely popular.
Yeah, and again, it just shows you the talent that these people that were appearing on these variety shows had. I mean, like I said, they got their first appearance on Ed Sullivan's show too. But then by the time Flip Wilson has his show, he says, "Hey, you guys want to come on my show now?"
Yes. And variety shows were all over the place at that time. I think they became kind of discovered in the 50s, but they really became popular in the 60s because they had kind of honed out the format and really worked out the bugs.
Yeah.
Flip Wilson had his own show. Smothers Brothers had his own show. I mean, just about everybody that was a guest star on this show had their own show somewhere else. But it was a very, very different time. Because you really don't see that. Like we used to.
Yeah.
It pops up every once in a while, but it just doesn't have that power that it used to have.
Yeah, and okay, now my number 4 is an interesting one. Richard Pryor. Now, who's not a Richard Pryor fan? But of course, when I think of Richard Pryor, I think of all those great movies that he did with Gene Wilder. We can't forget him. I think he was in Superman 3 or something like that. And the thing about it is, in doing the research for this, Gar, I did go and watch some of Richard Pryor episodes, and they are as funny as hell. But again, like so many times when we do these episodes, we come to find out, these people actually, had a career before you were maybe even alive or you were even aware of them. And so I mentioned Richard Pryor as my number 4 because it looks like this is kind of where people started to really get to know Richard Pryor, when he started to really have a spotlight put on him. And what I mean by that is, in the late 70s, is when he kind of rose up as a stand-up comedian. But, also in the late 70s, he starts appearing during these Flip Wilson episodes. And that's how he kind of, people started to really see him and take him serious, before he'd ever done any of those movies.
Yes. And he was... God, I was going to say something, and just for some reason it jumped out of my mind, and I'll remember it, and I'll do it as
sure you will. Yeah.
But Richard Pryor in the 70s, that he did a movie. This is what it was. Okay,
Uh-huh.
he did a movie with Diana Ross.
Okay.
It was called Mahogany, and it wasn't a comedy.
Ah.
And it was a very serious, because it was a movie it was the story about Billie Holiday.
Oh, okay.
And a lot of people don't know this about me, because everybody knows me as this rock and roll musician. I'm the singer for a Guns N' Roses tribute band, all this stuff, and rock and roll. But I'm a huge jazz musician fan.
Okay.
My appreciation for jazz, goes all the way back, to Billie Holiday, which is really, really going back. And she is like my number 1 favorite jazz artist, singer, and her song Funny Valentine. I was in a band back in the 80s,
Uh-huh.
and one of the guys in the band wanted to do that song, her heyday song. I mean, this song is like Stairway to Heaven.
Now let me ask you, Gar, if you were to...
But let me tell the story.
Sure.
She, because if I get cut off, I won't even, be able to...
I got you. Go ahead, my friend.
But she, when the guy in the band wanted to do that song, I didn't want to do it.
Wow.
I was very against it and everything like that. And because I didn't think that I just wasn't seeing it, and I didn't think we could do it justice.
Okay, wow.
And we wound up doing that song, and it really stood out. It was our version of Funny Valentine was so good, and I lost that recording, and I've been trying to get that recording ever since. And there's still a chance that I might get it, but This is the whole thing about Richard Pryor. He did that movie with Diana Ross about Billie Holiday, and he was so good as a serious actor that had some serious problems.
Wow.
You know what I mean?
Well,
and he was so good in that movie. So, we really have to give him credit, because he's always been known as one of the greatest.
Yeah.
Not a great comedian, but he is considered one of the greatest comedians. But he was more than just a comedian, a lot of people don't know that. So hopefully, excuse me. Hopefully, anybody that might catch an interest in seeing that movie Mahogany, by all means, check it out. It's a really good movie, and of course, come on, it's starring Diana Ross, and Richard Pryor. And that movie came out around the same time that he was doing all of this stuff with Flip Wilson too.
Wow.
So don't forget that. The guy was a talent juggernaut.
And back then, Diana Ross was still in her prime, and Gar, I will say, just based on your review and description, that is a movie I'm going to definitely, check out. And Oh wow, and as far as Richard Pryor as a comedian, like I said, the thing about him is he could do a movie where, I mean, like you just said, he starred in a movie with Diana Ross. That says it all right there. I mean, he wasn't at that point. He wasn't necessarily the star feature of a movie, but he had that kind of name recognition. But to land a movie at that point in his career with Diana Ross, and then like I said, he did all those great movies with Gene Wilder, and it also showed that not only was he a great talent in his own right, but he could get with a comedian that was equally as talented and not have to show the other guy up. It was more about what was best for the film. They
Yes.
not showed each other up, but they worked together so that the movie would be a great feature film.
Yeah, it was great chemistry.
Yeah. And that was just so he definitely had to be included here. Okay, so who's your number 4, Gar?
Well, when we were when you came up with the idea and I was compiling this, I was thinking in my mind, that of course we're going to pick some of them that are going to be the same.
Yeah, but that's all right.
And this one stands out as one of those that I think it has a real strong possibility
sure.
that you picked him too. George Carlin.
No, I didn't. But okay, yeah, I could see why though, because he was big at that time.
Well, he was just kind of
coming
getting
his start. Yeah, that's what I mean. Yeah.
He was just getting his start, and people were discovering him. Yeah. And he wasn't just a guy that was doing side skits with Flip Wilson, because he was a side skit actor on the show. But he was doing. He was also writing for the show.
Interesting.
So he was doing
double duty. Yeah.
Double duty. He was an actor doing side skits on the show, but he was also in the writer's room coming up with those funny skits.
But could you imagine, Gar? Could you imagine at the time as a comedian on the rise? That's how a lot of those comedians would make money, is writing for shows like that. I mean, a lot of the people that Johnny Carson used to have write his monologue for him and stuff, a lot of those were well-known, comedians.
Yeah, God, what's his name? The comedian that had the late-night talk show.
Letterman?
Conan O'Brien.
Yeah, Conan O'Brien.
Conan O'Brien got his start as a writer.
Yeah, see.
He was writing for Saturday Night Live.
Yeah, and somebody thought, well, if he can write, for those people, then he should have his own show. So you just never know where a gig like that might lead. But yeah, you're so right. I mean, George Carlin is one of those other characters, very much like we mentioned Phyllis Diller earlier. Kind of, because he's passed away a number of years ago. He's starting to kind of fade from a memory, but you can still catch his great comedy routines and find them on YouTube and stuff. So I urge people to do that if they want to see who we're talking about.
Oh, I highly urge anyone that listens to our show that has never
heard of George
or doesn't really know anything about George Carlin.
Or you might have heard the name.
You have to check him out, because his comedy is still relevant today. There's a lot of comedians, that they do their comedy and it was funny at the time, but then you listen to it now and it's not relevant. And so you don't get it, and it's not funny to people. So people go, well, what was so funny about that guy? You know what I mean? But George Carlin is one of those guys that his comedy has no time, time frame or time period. It 50 years from today, if somebody discovers him, it'll still be funny. And his stuff is very relevant.
And looking at these old clips of the Flip Wilson show, one thing became really relevant to me, Gar. Why a show like this, you can check out all these years later on YouTube and still laugh just as hard as if, when you originally saw the episode. It's because it's not like a lot of the late night comedy shows today where, the host is insulting half the audience or half the people watching the show, or it's all about politics. I mean, there are certain things that are funny, don't get me wrong, but when all you do is bash, one guy, his show became just bashing the president because you don't like him. I mean, that gets to me, okay, get a new act, get a new joke. but Flip Wilson wasn't really political. He was just telling jokes to entertain, and that's why I dig a show like this, because it was for pure entertainment. It wasn't trying to score any political points. It wasn't. You know what I'm saying. It was for everybody.
Well, there's comedy everywhere. And,
yeah.
And some people will find it in politics.
Yeah.
So, and of course, if somebody finds it in politics, somebody's going to get it
somewhere else.
Get their feelings hurt, or or not like it. That's unfortunately.
I guess,
for me, if you go to my Facebook page, my Facebook page says this right. Very from the get-go, it says, "My name is Gar Borras, and I have absolutely no interest in anyone's political opinion."
Yeah, that's my point.
That is where I want to keep it.
Yeah. It's sad because I'm not going to name any names, but a lot of these late night guys, that are on today, they were funny at one time, but. They got more of a, I don't know what happened, but they just aren't as funny as they once were, when they were maybe coming up on the scene. But getting back to the Flip Wilson show, another thing we should note about the Flip Wilson show, Gar, is the fact that it was a variety show. He had, he did his own little comedy skits with some of the guests. He had, he interviewed some people. He had musical guests, they had everybody like from, the Jackson 5 to the Osmonds. And I was thinking we could have done a part 3 on just the musical guests, but we can save that for a future episode. Now, getting to my number 3, Gar, I went with Joan Rivers. And what's interesting about Joan Rivers here, so I've got my top 5 list. I've got 2 women on my list. Of course, that's Lucille Ball and then Joan Rivers at number 3. Joan Rivers I included because I realized, Joan Rivers, when she was coming up in the 70s, she got a lot of exposure, of course, on the Tonight Show with Johnny Carson. And that's where a lot of people first started to kind of see her. At least that's where I first became aware of her. And then in doing the research for this, come to find out, she also appeared on a couple episodes of the Flip Wilson show. And I thought, oh, wow, I didn't realize that she actually, appeared on the Flip Wilson show too. And I seen one of the episodes she did, and it was kind of funny because she was kind of bad-mouthing her husband and saying stuff about, awful sex they had and what a mess he was. And this is the same, husband that years later would sadly, commit suicide. And so I bring it up, first of all, because once again, Joan Rivers is a big comedian at times. She's really on the rise at this time. But she's appearing on the Flip Wilson show, and people are starting to really take notice. And again, a woman comedian of that caliber was, it was there weren't too many of them. And so when you had a woman like that kind of talking about her family and it's kind of not what you expect, And so I think that's why she was getting the attention she was,
Well, it was the formula that so many comedians were using in the 60s.
Yeah.
Because what she was doing was what just about every other comedian. I mean, Rodney Dangerfield, my wife. You know what I mean? It's just about every other comedian was doing that too. So it was. So just to put things in perspective, in the 60s,
that was going on.
That style of comedy was mainstream.
Yeah.
And it's hard for people to see that now because it's so far removed. You know what I mean? But if you were living in the 60s, what you described, her style of comedy was mainstream, and that's really what she was doing, was mainstream comedy. And
as mainstream as it was for a woman to get up there on stage and do that, it was not really expected, and that's why people thought it was so damn funny. People were laughing; they could not help from cracking up whenever she. And the thing is, like, she was really a serious contender in the late 70s. Like I said, she did many appearances on the Tonight Show with Johnny Carson, and she got to the point, Gar, because of all those appearances on the Tonight Show, where when Johnny Carson would take like a day off, or he was sick, she would fill in for him. She became for a while the permanent guest host of a Tonight Show. Now, Johnny Carson was a big wig guy in the business at that time, and so by the time Joan Rivers is offered a show of her own, this is like in the 80s or early 90s, Johnny Carson takes great offense because she doesn't tell him nothing about that she got this new show, and he just kind of blackballs her. And somebody asked him, "Hey, what do you think of Joan Rivers' new show?" Haven't seen it, so I can't comment. But he turned on her. He was real nasty, and that. So, but I bring up Joan Rivers and talk about all this because she had a time in her career when she was huge, and I think knowing that she did all these appearances on the Tonight Show, the Flip Wilson show, eventually gets a show of her own. It's not too successful. She had, even when her show was flopped and was pulled, she was doing her thing with jewelry, and she found a way to carry on until the day she died.
Well, that's just another thing from the 60s that's forgotten.
Yeah.
Women were subjugated.
Yeah.
And that's the truth.
Yeah.
All you have to do is watch Mad Men.
Yeah.
I love that show because it's so accurate.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It's really accurate as to what society was doing at that time.
Yeah.
And it was normal. It was like it was right and left that men subjugated women.
Yeah. Yeah.
And what you just described that Johnny Carson did to Joan Rivers was he tried to subjugate her. And subjugate is not a good word. Yeah. It's not a nice word.
Yeah.
It's not a nice thing to do.
Yeah.
And I completely understand women's frustration.
Yeah.
When I was young, I didn't know any better, and I didn't even know that I was doing things that were in that kind of manner.
Yeah.
And I distinctly remember girls getting upset at me and trying to explain their frustration, and that is exactly what their frustration was.
Yeah, and
they were being subjugated, and they're not going to allow people to put them under their thumb.
Yeah, and Gar...
It's a horrible thing to do to another human being.
Yeah, yeah.
And I think that is a horrible thing that Johnny Carson... I think he's a very talented man.
Yeah.
But I think he got to the point where he had so much power that he started abusing his power.
Yeah.
And that is an indicator right there.
Yeah, and from what I understand...
indicator of a man abusing his power.
Yeah, and from what I understand... he never spoke to her again. He took great pride in that. That was just kind of the way he was. Now, before we end our segment talking about Joan Rivers, I wanted to note that I took notice as I was watching one of the episodes she appeared on of a Flip Wilson show, and she was joking about how all the balding men in Hollywood were getting hair transplants. And I don't know if you remember at the time, Gar, that was a very big thing in the late 70s, early 80s. A lot of men were balding, and you started to see things like the hair club for men, and men would either get toupees or go to a wig shop or stuff like that. And
hair club for men.
Yeah, I took note of that, and even it's kind of even funny because I did not realize at the time when I was growing up, but like a lot of our favorite 80s rockers, when they started to bald, we didn't realize at the time, but a lot of them. That wasn't their real hair. They would get wigs and stuff to kind of continue the look, if you know what I mean. But that was a thing back in the day, and she was joking about it.
Tribute band things.
Yeah. And okay, Gar. So let's hear your number 3.
Okay, Tim Conway.
Oh, okay.
Tim Conway was like just about on every variety show imaginable.
And,
you know what I mean?
And I think...
But he was also on the Flip Wilson show, and he was just every appearance that Tim Conway did, you laughed.
Yeah, and there
was always something funny about what he was going to do.
And Gar, I think the Flip Wilson appearances predate Tim Conway, on the Carol Burnett show, so that's a great... reason for you including him here, because it shows that while many people may remember him from the Carol Burnett show, like so many of these other stars we're finding out that appeared on.
He was on Laughing.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. That's what I'm saying. Yeah, and of course, I love those movies he did with, Don Knotts. The two of those guys together, they just had great chemistry.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
The Apple Dumpling Gang. That's another one I think we got to do down the line, Gar. But yeah, you got a great list here, Gar, and it's amazing so far.
Well, my number 2, it has to be one that you picked too.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? We'll get there. We'll get there.
Okay. Well, my number 2, I picked. It's an obvious choice, I think. And we mentioned this character in the history of a show, Ed Sullivan. And Ed Sullivan is an obvious choice, Gar, because even Flip Wilson himself, as much as he appeared on the Tonight Show, he like credits Ed Sullivan with giving him his biggest break, because again he appeared on the he appeared on the Ed Sullivan Show a total of 26 times. In fact, I was watching one of the 2 episodes Ed Sullivan does on Flip Wilson's show, and Flip Wilson introduces him. Of course, he says, "I want to thank this man." He says, "Ed, you allowed me to appear on your show back in the day, total of 26 times. So I hope you'll come back. You have 25 more times that you're welcome back here, but you're welcome anytime." And he was saying that Ed Sullivan, he's the greatest finger pointer of all time. And again, that's something that is, it makes sense that he'd introduce him as that, because you don't realize that's the guy was pointing his finger at all those people on the Ed Sullivan Show. And it was a great way to kind of kind of a passing of the baton moment, like thanking his mentors, thanking him for giving him his start.
Well, I mean, he wasn't just a great comedian.
Uh-huh.
He was a great human being, and when you do things like that, it shows.
Yeah,
you know what I mean?
And even when I'm watching Ed Sullivan on the Flip Wilson Show, he says, he says, "Well, Flip, I don't have my show anymore. I'm kind of retired. I'm making these appearances, but I'm enjoying going on these other people's shows. Thanks for having me, because I'd like to give a surprise audience." And then the 2 of them start singing "Strangers in the Night" together. And again, that's another thing about the Flip Wilson Show. You wouldn't only get like great comedy skits. And again, when you see Ed Sullivan, you're not probably expecting him to break out in song, but he had that talent too, and that's what made this appearance so great.
Yeah. Yes. There you can never. You're surprising me. Because I think we're getting better at choosing. These when we do these.
Yeah.
Because there's so many in the past that we wind up picking the same one.
Yeah. Well, and I'll tell you, my process this time was I kind of had a couple of them that I thought, okay, I know this person was on, because what I did is I went online and I typed in like. So I asked something like, what were the top performances on the Flip Wilson Show? And it lists like, it tell you like Red Fox, Ed Sullivan, different people. So I like, okay, hey, those are people I know. I'm going to go. You can't obviously pick everybody. So we only got 5 people we picked on each of our lists. So I'm like, okay, well, I'm a Red Fox fan. Let me go check out what his appearances are like. And so like Ed Sullivan I knew, and I thought, okay, so he was an obvious choice. And I was impressed when I watched, the episode. That's kind of how I did it. Now, who is your number 2, Gar?
Okay, I would be surprised if this one's not on your list too. Red Fox.
Okay, yeah, Red Fox. I will just say was my number 1. But let's get into this now, okay? So Red Fox for me, Gar. Of course, I knew Red Fox, of course, because of Sanford and Son TV show in the mid to late 70s, and that's where I first became a Red Fox fan. Now, come to find out, after he became such a huge Red Fox, he got his rise like a lot of comedians in the clubs, and so I included Red Fox because actually these appearances on the Flip Wilson Show, I find out, predate Sanford and Son.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So that's why he had to be number 1. And even watching the episodes that he appeared on, it was totally different than the comedy he did on Sanford and Son. And that's one thing that really kind of made it stand out. And so I'm kind of getting an idea of what the guy was doing in the clubs. That, from what I know of Red Fox, if you listen to if you purchase any of his comedy records that he recorded from back in the day, his comedy in the clubs was really, really dirty, foul-mouthed, and this was kind of tame, I guess, for TV. But like there was one episode he did where, for example, he was talking about that he'd been married like 3 times or something. His third wife, who he'd recently married, he goes, I really loved her at the time when I married her, but he goes, I married once I got married to her. She now weighs 312 pounds. I don't love her as much as I used to. And it's kind of, again, trashing on his wife, but kind of in a harsh way. And it was a different kind of comedy, but hey, it was funny,
Well, and that's what I was saying. It was a mainstream thing at that time. Everybody bashing.
And then he even, of course, included, which I don't know if the Flip Wilson show was on today, that they'd get away with some of this stuff. And it was tame for TV. But, another example of what I'm talking about with Red Fox was, like, he was telling some racial jokes, like nothing too harsh, but like there's one where he said something to the effect that I don't usually hang out with a lot of white people, but I hold them for when the police come around or something. And again, nothing too wild, just it was different, but it showed us, how Red Fox came up, and this is even before Sanford and Son, and like we were talking about when part 1 of the Flip Wilson special ended last time, Gar. By the time the Flip Wilson show comes to an end, he's actually him and Red Fox are such good friends, because let's not forget that the reason he got the Flip Wilson show to begin with was because Johnny Carson asked Red Fox when he appeared on the Tonight Show years before, who is the funniest comedian to you, Red, right now? And he said, that's got to be Flip Wilson. So again, Red Fox has a lot to do with the success of Flip Wilson. Who knows what would have happened. And go ahead, Gar. I don't want to interrupt you.
For Red Fox, for me, he goes back to the the 50s.
Yeah, that's what I'm talking about.
And yes, and back when comedy albums, were kind of an underground thing, because a lot of people don't know that. They know comedy albums because comedy albums eventually became mainstream.
Yeah.
But when comedy albums first were kind of hitting the streets and people were becoming aware of it, it was an underground thing.
Sure.
And Red Fox was part of that underground, this new emerging comedy, that was going on in the 50s.
He was one of the originators of it, let's be honest. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And they kind of document that. There's a popular TV show called The Marvelous Miss Maisel. Mm-hmm. And in truth, it's a story about a female comedian that raised to popularity in the 1950s when it was unheard of for women to be comedians.
Wow.
And her story was based on what's her name? I had a shirt. You just mentioned her, one of your favorites.
Joan Rivers, Lucille Ball.
Joan Rivers, yes. Marvelous Miss Maisel is based on Joan Rivers because Joan Rivers, that's how she got her start.
Wow.
Was back in the 50s as underground. And her influences, were people like Red Fox. So when you watch Miss Maisel, there is an episode where she goes into one of those record stores, and it's a total hole in the wall, and they're not selling anything mainstream at all. It's all underground stuff, and so and people are going into these places, and they're and they're looking for, albums and stuff like that. And that's how people discovered these comedians, was through these albums in these underground stores. It was a whole underground movement back in the 1950s. And so this is a wonderful opportunity to really kind of, clarify the lens, of the 1950s, what was going on back in those days. And so Red Fox was a big champion of that whole movement, and he was one of the most popular ones. That really, there's so many comedians that came from that underground whole thing, say like Joan Rivers, that we don't even know about. But at that time, this was going on, and this is how Red Fox was gaining his popularity, was through those albums back in the 1950s.
Which is why, Gar, I'm very glad.
You look at those albums now as a passé thing, because you will never find a comedy album being released today.
Yeah, and Gar, I'm glad we mentioned Red Fox here, because I'll be honest, I'm a huge Red Fox fan. I've been wanting to do like a Sanford and Son episode, but the thing is, we're gonna have to probably, to do it justice, like maybe do at least a 2 or 3 part. I'll tell you why, because there's so much to talk about Red Fox, like we've just said, before you even get to Sanford and Son, and so we got to talk about his rise, in the comedy clubs, and then even later TV appearances on the Tonight Show, on the Flip Wilson, and then Sanford and Son. And then the interesting thing, like I said, that him and Red had such a, I'm talking about Flip Wilson, had such a connection that by the time the Flip Wilson show comes in, we learned last time that Flip Wilson was originally offered the role for Lamont Sanford to play the dummy son, which I can't even imagine, but I'm sure the reason he got the offer initially was because they were such good friends. But who knows, what the show would have been like if that had been the pairing,
It's all, speculation. I mean, when you look at Red Fox, he goes back to the beatnik days, pre-hippies, you know what I mean, in 1950s. And, that was, the beatniks were the hippies of the 1950s.
Yeah.
And so, that's how far Red Fox goes. So when you look at that and you look at the span of his career, my God, his career, his relevancy in comedy was like many, many decades.
And it's really, a lot of it is autobiographical. I'm gonna post some of these clips we've been discussing today, Gar, next week, and when this show premieres next Saturday, because just so people can really get a glimpse of what we're talking about, because there was also, because Red Fox was a big celebrity at the time, and again, this is pre-Sanford and Son, but he's appearing on the Flip Wilson show. People know who Red Fox is back in the 70s, and the thing about it is, there's also, after he appeared in the skit and he's telling his jokes, where Red Fox came out with Flip Wilson, and they allowed the audience to ask Red some questions, anything they wanted, and not only did he answer all their questions, but a lot of it, actually, on that very show, they announced that the next night, Sanford and Son was going to premiere, and he was kind of telling the audience about what the show was about, and that Red Fox was actually a name of somebody he knew from back in the day, and a lot of the stuff from a new TV show was going to be based on where he grew up in St. Louis, and so a lot of that stuff we find out was autobiographical.
Yeah, comedy is based in, it's like all fiction is actually based in reality.
Yeah.
And people, you never think about that, because you think of the word fiction.
I mean, they got to get their, their stories, their ideas from somewhere. Even if it's not specifically.
Yes. And all comedy characters, virtually every funny character that you see, like a Rosanna Dana, or you can go on and on of all these comedians that do these characters. Those comedians were influenced by a person
to
create that character.
Yeah.
There is a person that comedian met, that comedian goes, oh my God, this is gold.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And then just vamped on it and then created these characters. But virtually every one of them, all of them, are based on real people or real events. They just saw the humor in it rather than just documenting the event.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, and
so he ought to, of course, and for Red Fox, what is the closest thing to him? Of course, his memories of growing up.
Yeah, and now Gar,
you know what I mean?
I don't believe we got to your number one. What's your number one?
Well, I was really sure that you weren't going to pick this one.
Okay.
This is so worthy of being number one.
Sure.
Because these two people are the parents of somebody that we consider like a great comedian today.
Okay, wow.
And these two were the parents of this guy.
Okay.
You know what I mean? And I have to tell you that I was watching them back then when they were doing their comedy act, and they were funny. They were really good together.
Oh.
They were a dynamic duo, and it is Stiller and Mira. Do you know who that is?
No, I'm going to have to look that up. Wow.
Okay.
Yeah.
Think of the name Stiller.
Ben Stiller. Okay, yeah.
Stiller.
Ben Stiller.
It's Ben Stiller's father.
Oh, okay.
And Ben Stiller's mother.
Okay, yeah.
Those two people were regulars on the Flip Wilson show. They were they were guests, and they did their comedy act on the Flip Wilson show. This was when Stiller and Mira were at the top of their game. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
They were at the apex of their popularity, their success, and everything.
Okay, I know who you're talking about now.
They were so good.
Yeah, I know who you're talking about now.
They were so good, and that's another really good reason why I'm bringing this up, because now it's sparking you to go check it out. Because we all know by Ben Stiller's father's guest appearances on his show and his guest appearances on Friends and all that stuff, we know how funny Ben Stiller's father is.
Yeah.
But his mother just kind of stepped out of the spotlight.
Wow.
And she, people don't even remember who she was. Back at the time when they were making appearances on the Flip Wilson show, she was incredibly funny.
Wow. I got to check that out. Okay, yeah. I mean, I know the dad. I've seen him enough. I know who you're talking about now. Okay, yeah.
Yeah, this is Ben Stiller's parents before Ben Stiller was even born.
Wow. So definitely comedy was no doubt in that family.
Yes. Can you imagine what it was like to be Ben Stiller as a kid, growing up in that house with those two as your parents?
No, I can't even really imagine that. That's.
Oh my God, that must have been. I mean, there must have been some absolutely wonderful, freaking priceless moments.
Yeah.
Unforgettable, funny moments. That's just special to them.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? They were a dynamic duo, dude. They were, and they're forgotten now. You've forgotten them. And people that are probably listening to the show have completely forgotten them. Go check them out.
Wow,
Go check out George Carlin.
Yeah, definitely.
He is still funny today.
Tim Conway's another great one.
Stiller and Mira. My God, their comedy is still good today.
Yeah, in fact, Gar, I got to say, before we end today's episode, getting back to Red Fox for a minute, it's kind of funny, sad, tragic, sad, how oftentimes art imitates, real life. I mean, the big joke on Sanford and Son was a thing. the routine where he was constantly, oh my God, this is a big one. I'm having the big one. I'm coming to join you, Elizabeth. And on the set of his final TV show, which wasn't nowhere as a huge hit as Sanford and Son, it was called The Royal Family. But he actually died on the set of the TV show, having the big one. And but again, all the way up to the end, that's one of the things he's remembered for. The way he went out, and sadly, when he died, like, he was dirt poor, living in Las Vegas. He lost a lot of his money to the IRS. A few years before he died.
Well, he wasn't filing his taxes.
Yeah. I'm just saying,
eventually it was going to get caught.
And he got caught up.
Eventually it was going to catch up with him. You know what I mean?
Same thing happened to.
It was something that he did to himself.
And
unfortunately, I really feel bad for him.
But yeah, you're right. I mean,
but,
same thing even happened to.
Him losing all his fortune and everything. He knew.
Yeah, he let it get. Yeah.
For a long time that was coming.
And then the same thing happened to Willie Nelson, but he got his money back because he went on tour and I guess he paid back by IRS.
Well, he still had the ability to
make money,
make a living.
Yeah.
Because I'm surprised that Willie Nelson at 90s isn't still performing.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? The only reason why Willie Nelson isn't performing is not because he doesn't want to.
Yeah.
Is because he can't anymore.
Yeah.
And that's my philosophy. I'm going to keep doing what I'm doing until the wheels fall off. And I keep saying that over and over and over because I completely and totally relate to that mentality.
And Gar,
no matter how much the expiration date is looming, you keep going.
Yeah.
Because for him it was comedy. But for me, it's music. It's music that just gives me so much joy and so much reason to live and so much reason to put that next step in front of the last step and just keep marching forward.
And I can hear that in your voice when you talk about, And before you wrap up today's episode, Gar, I think going back to the beginning of today's episode, you're talking about the fact that everybody thinks of you as a rock guy. And you're also a huge jazz fan. I probably would imagine that you have appreciation for jazz music as well because of all your years of playing the bass guitar.
Well, yeah. When I was a kid, I've told this story so many times.
Yeah,
but when I was a kid, I was just like every other young boy, with full of vinegar and full of energy. I'm going to take over the world. And for me, it was music. And I used to tell my friends, I want to be the best. I want to be the best.
Yeah.
And I remember, there were older guys, that I was hanging around with. And they were saying, well, if you want to be the best, then you gotta play jazz.
Yeah.
And I didn't even know what jazz was.
You eventually found out,
and I was like, had that question mark above my head. You know what I mean? Going, what the heck? Yeah. And so I dove into jazz, and they were right. The level of capability as musicians in jazz. I'm not saying every musical piece of jazz is like incredible works of art, but in order to play a lot of the really challenging stuff of jazz, even to this day it has been impossible.
Wow,
that is how difficult jazz is.
Okay.
It is extreme. I would say it's the akin to Olympic level gymnastics, but just music.
Well, there you go, Gar. And
see, when you talk about gymnastics and you watch it, you can see the level of difficulty. You can see how incredible the talent of these people doing it. And not everybody can do it because these guys are doing it in the Olympics.
Sure.
You know what I mean? That is exactly what jazz is. It's the Olympics of music.
Yeah, and Gar, to finally wrap up today's episode, talking about music, which we will be next time we do this in 2 weeks from now. You and I, for the longest time, been wanting to do an episode on WKRP in Cincinnati. And, of course, that's based on a TV show from late 1970s, early 80s about a radio station in Cincinnati. And we'll be getting into all of that 2 weeks from now.
My God, you couldn't talk about a more perfect show to hit TV in the 1970s at that time for a guy like me when I was in my my late teens, early 20s.
And there hasn't been another show like that since then or before.
Yeah, it was my God, it had all these elements, music and all, everything about it. I just embraced it with a big bear hug.
Yeah, we will get into it, my friend, and today's episode is going to premiere next Saturday. Thanks for doing this, Gar. It's been a ton of fun.
Absolutely.